I found old emails planning my sister's life while mine was always forgotten. I was 34 years old when I learned that my college fund had paid for my sister's wedding, and I learned it from an email that wasn't even meant for me. Not a confrontation, not a confession. Just an email thread I stumbled into while looking for an old tax document. The kind of ordinary afternoon task that should have meant nothing. I want to tell you that the moment I read it, I felt rage, or that something inside me broke cleanly in half so I'd at least have a clear before and after to point to. But that's not what happened. What happened was quieter and somehow worse. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside my laptop, and I read the words my parents had written to each other when I was 17. And I realized that the story I'd been telling myself my whole life, the one where I was simply the less impressive child, the one who needed less, the one who understood, had been written for me before I ever had a say in it. I should start at the beginning, because if I just tell you about the emails, you'll think I'm overreacting, the same way my family always said I was. You'll think, like they did, that I was keeping score, that I was being sensitive, that I was making something into a big thing when it was really nothing. So let me give you the whole shape of it, slowly, the way it actually unfolded. Because the cruelty was never in any single moment. The cruelty was in the pattern, and patterns are invisible until you're standing far enough back to see them. My name is Claire. I have one sibling, my younger sister Megan, who is 2 years younger than me and who has been, for as long as I can remember, the center of gravity in our family. I don't say that bitterly. Or I'm trying not to say it bitterly. Megan is genuinely charming. She has the kind of warmth that makes strangers feel chosen, the kind of laugh that fills a room and makes everyone else laugh too, even if they didn't hear the joke. As a kid, she was the one who got picked first for everything, the one teachers wrote glowing notes about, the one our relatives crowded around at holidays. And I loved her. That's the part people don't understand when I tell this story. I didn't resent Megan for being lovable. I resented the math my parents did around her, the way the whole household quietly reorganized itself to keep her at the center, and how that math always seemed to subtract from me. Our parents are Diane and Robert. My mother, Diane, is the kind of woman who is wonderful in public and exhausting in private. A person who can make you feel like the most important person in the world for exactly as long as she needs something from you. My father, Robert, is quieter. He's not cruel. He's something I find harder to forgive. Actually, he's absent in the way that men of his generation are taught to call peace. He let things happen. He looked at the table when things got tense. He'd squeeze my shoulder on his way out of a room, as if a squeeze could substitute for a sentence. For most of my life, I thought of my mother as the problem and my father as neutral. It took me much longer to understand that neutrality, when you have the power to change something and you don't, is just another way of choosing a side. I was the easy child. That's the word they used, and I wore it like an identity for 30 years. Easy, low maintenance, independent. Claire never gives us any trouble. Claire's so self-sufficient. We never have to worry about Claire. I used to hear those words and feel a small warm pride, the way a dog feels when you scratch its ears. It took me an embarrassingly long time to understand that self-sufficient was not a compliment. It was a job description. It was the role I'd been assigned so that all the attention, the worry, the resources, the planning could be funneled toward the daughter they'd decided was worth the investment. Let me tell you about the first time I really understood the shape of it, even though I didn't have the words for it then. I was about 9, and Megan was 7, and it was the week before the start of a new school year. My mother took us shopping for clothes, the way she did every August. We went to the mall, and I remember the specific smell of it, that mix of pretzel salt and air conditioning, and I remember being excited because back-to-school shopping was one of the rare times we did something together as just the three of us. Megan tried on outfit after outfit, twirling in the mirror, and my mother cooed over every single one. "Oh, that's adorable. Oh, we have to get that one. Megan, you look like a little movie star." And Megan beamed and we filled the cart and I waited, because I figured my turn was coming. When we got to the section for my size, my mother looked at the prices and her whole demeanor changed. She got practical. "Claire, you don't really need that many new things. You take such good care of your clothes." She picked out 2 plain shirts and a pair of jeans, and when I held up a sweater I really wanted, soft and dark green, she said, "Honey, you don't need that. Be sensible." And I put it back. I put it back, and I felt embarrassed for even wanting it, embarrassed for not being sensible. And I told myself the story right there at 9 years old. Megan needs things, and I don't. Megan is the one who gets, and I am the one who understands. I built that story brick by brick over the next 25 years, and my parents handed me the bricks, and I thanked them for it. That's the thing about a role like mine. You don't get forced into it once. You get invited into it 1,000 times, in small ways, until it stops feeling like a role and starts feeling like who you are. I became the responsible one because being responsible was the only kind of attention available to me. If I couldn't be the daughter they delighted in, I could at least be the daughter they relied on. And relying on someone, I learned, feels almost like love if you've never been given the real thing to compare it to. By the time I was in high school, the pattern had hardened into routine. Megan struggled in school, and so my parents hired tutors, sat with her over homework, drove her to special programs, advocated with her teachers. I got straight A's quietly in my room, and nobody noticed, because there was nothing to fix. When Megan wanted to do competitive dance, my parents found the money for the lessons, the costumes, the travel to competitions in other states. I wanted to do debate, which cost almost nothing, and even then my mother sighed about the weekend tournaments and asked if I really needed to do all of them or if I could be reasonable about it. I learned to want cheap things. I learned to want quiet things. I learned to make my needs small enough that they could fit in the gaps left over after Megan's were met. And I told myself it was fine. I genuinely did. I want you to understand that I was not walking around as a teenager seething with resentment. I was, on the surface, a happy and high-achieving kid. I got a partial scholarship to a state school, took out loans for the rest, worked 2 jobs through college, and graduated with a degree in accounting. I built a whole life out of being the one who didn't need help. I became an accountant, of all things, a person whose entire profession is keeping track of where money actually goes versus where people say it goes. The irony of that is not lost on me now. Here is the thing I believed, the central load-bearing belief of my whole childhood. I believed there simply hadn't been enough to go around. I believed my parents weren't wealthy, that money was tight, that the reason Megan got more was that the family had only so much and had to make choices. I believed there had been a college fund, a small one, and that it had run out, or never really existed in the form I imagined, and that the loans I took were just the reality of our family's finances. I never questioned it. Why would I? I had been raised to believe that questioning was selfish, that keeping track was small, that good daughters didn't ask where the money went. I need to tell you about the wedding, because the wedding is the center of everything, even though I didn't know it at the time. Megan got married when she was 26 and I was 28. By then I had a steady career, a small apartment I was proud of, and a boyfriend named David who would later become my husband. Megan's wedding was a production. I remember being genuinely happy for her, helping her plan, being her maid of honor. It was a beautiful wedding, an outdoor venue, 150 guests, a live band, the whole thing. I remember standing at the reception thinking how lovely it all was, how happy my parents looked. My mother glowing in a way I rarely saw. My father actually relaxed and laughing. I remember asking my mother, gently, how they'd managed to afford it. because even then the accountant in me was doing rough math and the numbers seemed large for a couple who'd always told me money was tight. And my mother had given me a look I now understand completely but didn't then, a look that was half warning and half practiced ease. And she'd said, "Oh, we've been saving. Don't worry about it. It's Megan's special day." And I dropped it. Of course I dropped it. Asking felt rude. It felt like keeping score. So I drank my champagne and I gave my toast and I cried at all the right moments. And I had no idea, none, that I was standing in a tent that I had, in a sense, paid for. David noticed things about my family before I let myself notice them. That's one of the great gifts of marrying someone who didn't grow up inside your particular fog. He'd come to a family dinner and afterward, in the car on the way home, he'd be quiet. And then he'd say something like, "Did you notice that your mom asked Megan 3 times if she'd eaten enough and didn't ask you anything the whole night?" And I'd defend it. I'd explain it away. "That's just how she is. Megan's been stressed." And David would nod and let it go, because he loved me and he could see that I wasn't ready, that I was holding something together with both hands and any push might bring it down before I was prepared to catch what fell. The first time I really gave money, real money, money I felt, was a few years into my marriage. Megan and her husband, Tyler, were buying a house, and they were short on the down payment. The way I found out was a phone call from my mother, and I should have known something was up because her voice did that thing it does, that sweetening, that careful warmth she puts on right before she asks for something. "Claire, honey, how are you? How's David? How's work?" 3 questions in a row, all of them unusual, all of them setting the table. And then, "Listen, I hate to even bring this up, but Megan and Tyler are in a bit of a tough spot with the house, and you know how it is for young couples starting out. And we were thinking, well, you're so good with money. You've always been so smart about these things. We were thinking maybe you could help them out a little. Just a loan. They'd pay you back, of course." I want to be honest about my own part in this, because if I make myself the pure victim, then I'm doing the same thing my family did, just in reverse. I said yes immediately. I didn't even pause. I wrote them a check for $12,000 and I felt good about it. I felt useful. I felt, for once, like I was the important one, like I had something the golden child needed and I could be the one to provide it. That's the trap, you see. They had trained me so well that being used felt like being valued, and I leapt at the chance to be used because it was the closest thing to love I knew how to recognize. The loan was never repaid. I never asked about it, because asking felt petty. And the few times it came up, years later, the story had quietly changed. It was no longer a loan. It had become the money you gave Megan for the house. And then eventually, in my mother's retelling, it had become something Megan and Tyler barely remembered receiving at all. A vague gift from a vague past, nothing worth keeping track of. "Why are you keeping score?" my mother said once, when I made the mistake of referencing it. "Family helps family. You're not going to make a thing out of $12,000, are you?" And I wasn't. I never made a thing out of anything. That was my whole function. The second incident is harder to talk about because it involves a moment when I needed them and they weren't there. And you'd think that kind of thing would be obvious, would be a clean wound. But it wasn't. It was so quiet that I almost didn't notice I'd been hurt until much later. David and I tried to have a baby for 3 years. We went through 2 rounds of fertility treatment, and then I had a miscarriage at 11 weeks. And it was the worst thing that has ever happened to me. I told my mother on the phone, crying, and she was sympathetic in the moment, genuinely, I think. But here's what happened over the following weeks. Megan, around that same time, was having a difficult pregnancy with her second child. She was on modified bed rest, uncomfortable, scared, and the entire family apparatus mobilized around Megan. My mother went and stayed with her for 2 weeks. My father drove down to help with the older kid. The family group chat, which I'll get to, filled with messages of support, casseroles organized, a whole rotation of care. And me? I got a few texts. "How are you holding up, honey?" And then, before I could even answer properly, the conversation would swing back to Megan, to her bed rest, to her swollen ankles, to the logistics of who was bringing dinner. I remember lying on my couch one evening, still bleeding, still hollowed out, scrolling through that group chat, watching my family pour love into my sister like water into a cup, and I texted my mother privately, "I'm really not doing okay, Mom." And she wrote back, "I know, sweetheart. It's such a hard time for everyone. Megan's having a rough go too. We'll all get through it together. We'll all get through it together." As if my dead baby and Megan's swollen ankles were the same weather we were all weathering. As if my grief were a contribution to the general family difficulty, rather than a thing that was specifically, personally happening to me, and deserved to be tended to on its own. David found me crying that night, and he didn't say anything for a long time. He just held me. And then quietly, into my hair, he said, "They don't see you, Claire. I'm so sorry, but I don't think they ever have." And I pulled away and I got angry at him, which was unfair, because he was telling me a true thing I wasn't ready to hear. "Don't say that about my family," I said. "They love me. They're just dealing with a lot." David nodded and let it go, like he always did, and I lay awake half the night defending people who weren't there to hear me do it. The third thing I'll tell you about happened maybe a year after that, and it's the one that, looking back, should have cracked the whole thing open. My father had a health scare, a cardiac event, a stent, a hospital stay, a long recovery, and guess who managed it? Not Megan, who lived 20 minutes away from my parents while I lived 2 hours. I took time off work. I drove back and forth. I sat with the doctors and translated the medical jargon for my mother. I organized his medications, set up the follow-up appointments, handled the insurance paperwork, called the pharmacy, built a spreadsheet. Of course, I built a spreadsheet tracking his recovery. I did all of it because I was the responsible one, because I was good with this stuff, because I was the one who could. And Megan visited twice. She brought flowers and took a photo with Dad in his hospital bed and posted it with a long caption about how scary it had been and how grateful she was that he was okay. And the caption got 200 likes and dozens of comments about what a devoted daughter she was. And I read that caption sitting in the hospital parking garage after a 6-hour day of actually devoted daughtering, and I felt something I'd never quite let myself feel before. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and clearer. A kind of bewilderment. How was it possible, I thought, that I could do all the work and she could get all the credit, and everyone, including me, would treat that as the natural order of things? But I swallowed it. I always swallowed it. My father recovered, and at the next family gathering my mother stood up and gave a little speech thanking everyone for their support during Dad's scare. And she singled out Megan for being there for us. And she said about me, almost as an afterthought, "And Claire helped with some of the paperwork." Some of the paperwork. I had run the entire recovery, but I smiled and I raised my glass because that's what you do. And David's hand found my knee under the table and squeezed, and I knew he'd heard it too. And I knew he wouldn't say anything because he'd learned that I wasn't ready, and I hated that he was right. So now you understand the shape of it. Now you understand the fog I lived in. I'm telling you all this so that when I get to the emails, you understand why they hit me the way they did. Because the emails didn't tell me anything I didn't already half know. They just made it impossible to keep not knowing. It was a Sunday afternoon in October. David was out running errands. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop, going through old files because I was helping my parents naturally sort out some financial paperwork related to their estate planning. My mother had given me access to an old shared email account years ago, a family account they'd set up to keep documents in one place, and she'd long since forgotten I had access. She'd asked me, in her sweet voice to find that old document about the house refinancing. You're so good with this stuff. And so I was digging through years of archived emails looking for it. I found the refinancing document, and right below it in the search results, because they'd been filed in the same folder around the same time, was a thread of emails between my mother and father from when I was 17. The subject line was just, "The girls." I almost didn't open it. I want you to know how close I came to just closing the laptop, finding the document I needed, and going on with my life inside the fog. But the accountant in me, the part of me that needs to know where the money actually went, clicked on it. And I read it. And I read it again. And then I sat there for a very long time while my coffee went cold and the kitchen got dim and I didn't turn the lights on. I'm not going to be able to convey exactly what was in those emails without it sounding like melodrama, because that's the strange thing. The words themselves were so casual, so reasonable, so administrative. That was the horror of it. My parents weren't writing about how much they loved Megan more, or how much they resented me. They were doing logistics. They were doing math. They were planning in the calm and practical tone of two adults managing a household budget, the entire architecture of their daughters' futures, and they had decided, explicitly, in writing, where the resources would go. The thread started with my father asking my mother how they were going to handle college coming up for both of them eventually. And my mother had written back a long, thoughtful, devastating message that I will remember for the rest of my life. She wrote that they needed to be realistic about where the investment makes sense. She wrote that I was going to be fine no matter what. She's that kind of kid. She'll figure it out. She always does. She wrote that I was, honestly, probably better off having to work for things. It builds character, and she's not going to resent it the way Megan would. She wrote that Megan needs more support to reach her potential, and that it doesn't make sense to split everything 50-50 when their needs are so different. And then, this is the part she laid out a plan. She wrote that they should let Claire take loans and work. She won't mind. She understands these things. And that they should preserve the savings for Megan, who's going to need help with school and probably beyond weddings, houses, that kind of thing. Let's think long-term about Megan. Let's think long-term about Megan. And my father, my quiet, neutral father, the one I'd spent my whole life forgiving for merely failing to intervene, my father had written back 2 words, just 2 words, at the bottom of that email, agreeing to the whole plan. He wrote, "Makes sense." There were more emails in the thread over the following years. A recurring conversation, returned to again and again, always in that same reasonable tone. When I got my partial scholarship, there was an email from my mother to my father that said, "See, I told you Claire would be fine. This frees up more for Megan." When I took out my loans, there was a note about how Claire's handling her own situation, as expected. And then, years later, an email about Megan's wedding, where my mother wrote about wanting to give Megan the wedding she deserves, and discussed using the money we set aside. The money. The savings. The fund I'd been told didn't exist for me. The fund that had been my college money in every sense except the one that counted, which was who it was actually for. I sat in that dim kitchen and I felt the whole story of my childhood reorganize itself around these emails like iron filings snapping into line around a magnet. Every "be sensible." Every "you don't need that." Every "you're so self-sufficient." Every time I'd made my needs small and felt proud of myself for it. None of it had been about money being tight. The money had been there, it had simply been allocated. There had been a decision, a real decision, made by 2 adults at a kitchen table or a computer screen, that one daughter was worth investing in and the other one would be fine. And I had spent my entire life proving them right, working twice as hard for half as much, and earning their approval precisely by needing nothing, which meant the better daughter I was, the more I confirmed that I'd never needed anything in the first place. The first thing I felt, and I'm ashamed of this, was embarrassment. Not anger, embarrassment. A hot, full-body shame. The kind you feel when you realize everyone in a room has been in on something but you. I thought about all the times I'd defended my parents to David, all the times I'd explained away the slights, all the times I'd called my mother to apologize after some small attempt at standing up for myself, because I couldn't bear the silence. I thought about how I'd built an entire identity, a whole personality, around being the one who didn't need help, and how that identity had been handed to me, deliberately to make their math easier. I felt like a fool. I felt like the world's biggest, most obedient fool. Then came the denial, which is strange to feel about a document right in front of you, but I felt it anyway. I told myself I was reading it wrong. I told myself this was an old conversation between stressed parents trying to budget, that it didn't mean what it obviously meant, that any parents might have similar conversations, and I was just hurt to see the sausage being made. I told myself my mother loved me, that she'd said herself I was that kind of kid, and wasn't that almost a compliment? Didn't she trust me? Wasn't being trusted to be fine its own kind of faith? I twisted myself into knots trying to find a version of the emails that didn't mean my parents had looked at their two children and decided one was an investment and one was a foregone conclusion. When David got home, he found me still at the table in the dark. He turned on the kitchen light, that old fixture above the table that we'd been meaning to replace for years, the one that buzzes faintly and casts everything a little yellow, and he saw my face, and he stopped. "What happened?" he said. And I turned the laptop toward him, and I watched him read, and I watched his jaw tighten, and I watched him reach the two words my father wrote, "Make sense." And I watched something in his expression that was almost grief. Grief on my behalf. The grief of a man who had been trying to tell me this gently for 10 years and had finally been proven right and took no satisfaction in it at all. He sat down across from me. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say, "They never saw you." He just took my hand and he said, "I'm so sorry, Claire. You didn't deserve any of that." And that was when I finally cried, because someone had finally said the simple true thing that my whole family had spent 34 years refusing to say, that it wasn't fair, that I hadn't deserved it, that being treated like the spare daughter was not the same as being loved for being low maintenance. I didn't do anything for a long time, weeks. I want to be honest about that because the version of this story where I read the emails and immediately marched off to confront everyone with a brilliant speech is not the version that happened. The version that happened is that I carried the emails around inside me like a stone for weeks while I went to work and made dinner and went to family events and smiled. I went to Sunday dinner at my parents' house 2 weeks after I found them, and I sat at the table eating my mother's pot roast and I said nothing. And the not saying was so heavy I thought it might crush me. My mother used her sweet voice and asked me to look at some insurance thing for her, and I said yes, of course, because the muscle memory of being useful was so deep I couldn't override it even with the emails fresh in my mind. I was afraid. That's the truth I had to sit with. I was afraid that if I stopped being useful, if I stopped being the responsible one, the one who handled things, the one who didn't need anything, then there would be nothing left of me in this family at all. Because what was my role if not that? Megan's role was to be loved. My role was to be relied upon. If I took away the reliance, what would they have me for? Would they have me for anything? That was the fear that kept me silent for weeks. Not that they'd be angry, but that they wouldn't be. That I'd set down the weight I'd been carrying and discover that the weight was the only thing connecting me to them, and that without it I would simply float away, and no one would notice I was gone. I talked to a therapist about it, eventually. I'd never been to therapy before. I was the one who was fine, remember? the one who didn't need help, and there was something almost rebellious about even making the appointment. She was a calm woman named Patricia, and I told her the whole story, the lifetime of it, and then I told her about the emails, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that rearranged my thinking. She said, "It sounds like you learned very early that love in your family was conditional on you not needing anything. So you became someone who didn't need anything. And now you're afraid that if you start needing things like fairness, like acknowledgement, you'll lose the love. But Claire, what you're describing isn't love that you'd lose. It's a transaction, and you're allowed to stop transacting. You're allowed to stop transacting." I wrote that down. I carried it around the way I'd carry the emails, except this stone was lighter. This one I could set down and pick up at will. This one helped me stand up straighter instead of bending me toward the ground. The thing that finally moved me to act wasn't the emails themselves. It was something smaller, which is usually how it goes. It was a phone call from my mother, the sweet voice, and I knew before she even got to it that there was an ask coming. Megan and Tyler were in a tough spot again. Tyler's business had hit a rough patch. They needed help, and my mother was calling, in her sweetest voice, to ask if I could help them out, just until they get back on their feet. You know how good you are with money. And you and David don't have kids, so it's not like you have those expenses. You don't have kids, so it's not like you have those expenses. She said it lightly. She didn't even know what she'd said. She didn't know that David and I had spent 3 years and tens of thousands of dollars and one buried grief trying to have those expenses. She'd reduced the worst thing that ever happened to me into a reason I had spare money to give my sister. And something in me, finally, after 34 years, simply declined to bend. I didn't yell. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect this part of the story to be a big explosion, and it wasn't. I was very calm. I think I surprised myself with how calm I was. I said, "Mom, I'm not going to be able to help with that." And there was a pause, a genuinely shocked pause, because I had never said no before, not once, not in 34 years. And then my mother did what she always did, which was reach for the levers that had always worked. "Oh," she said. "Well, I just thought it's family, Claire. Family helps family. Megan would do it for you." And I said gently, because I wasn't trying to wound her. Would she, though? When I had my miscarriage, where was everyone? And my mother said, "Oh, Claire, that was years ago. Why are you bringing that up now? That's not fair." And I said, "It's a real question. I'm not trying to be unfair. I'm trying to understand how this family works, because I've been thinking about it a lot lately." She got defensive, of course. She said I was being sensitive. She said I always took things the wrong way. She said, "I don't know what's gotten into you." And I almost backed down the pole to smooth it over, to apologize, to make her sweet voice come back, was almost physical, like gravity. But I held on to Patricia's words. I held on to "make sense," those 2 words my father wrote. And I said, "Mom, I found some old emails, from when I was 17, between you and Dad, about college and money, and how you decided to handle things differently for me and Megan." The line went quiet, not the dramatic kind of quiet, just a real human pause, the pause of a person whose past has caught up with her in a way she didn't plan for. And then my mother said the thing that told me everything I needed to know about whether I was overreacting. She didn't say, "What emails?" She didn't say, "I don't know what you're talking about." She said in a careful, lowered voice, "Those were private. You shouldn't have been reading those." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Let me explain." Just that I shouldn't have been reading them. The crime in her mind was that I'd seen the decision, not that the decision had been made. I didn't argue. I'd learned that arguing was its own kind of transaction, That explaining myself to people who had decided what I was worth before I could even speak was just another way of asking for a verdict I'd never get in my favor. So I just said, "Okay, Mom, I have to go. I'll talk to you later." And I hung up, and I sat in my quiet kitchen, and I waited to feel triumphant. And I didn't. I felt sad. I felt the specific, deep sadness of finally understanding something you'd have given anything not to understand. But underneath the sadness, faint but real, there was something I hadn't felt in a very long time, maybe ever. There was relief. The relief of setting something down. What happened next was not dramatic, and I think that's important to say, because the consequences in real life are almost never the kind you see in stories. No one was destroyed. No one collapsed. No one stood in my doorway begging forgiveness. What happened instead was much quieter and, in a way, much more telling. I stopped doing the things. That was the whole of my revenge, if you can even call it that, and I don't think you can. I stopped managing my parents' paperwork. When my mother called and asked me to handle some financial thing in her sweet voice, I said, "You should probably ask Megan to help with that, or hire someone." And the silence on the other end was the silence of a machine encountering an input it had no programming for. Megan, of course, did not help with the paperwork, because Megan had never in her life been asked to be useful, because usefulness was not her role. And so my parents had to hire an accountant and a financial advisor, and they had to pay for the things I'd done for free for years, and they had to discover what my labor had actually been worth in dollars, which I suspect was illuminating for them, in a way no speech of mine ever could have been. The money requests stopped getting answered. When the next tough spot came up, and they came up regularly because Tyler's business was a perpetual tough spot, I simply said no. Not cruelly. Just clearly. That's not something I'm able to do. And there's no argument against I'm not able to, really. You can argue with I won't. You can guilt someone out of I won't. But I'm not able to is a closed door. And I had finally learned how to close one. The family group chat got quieter, at least for me, because I muted it. For years, that chat had been a kind of low-grade torture, a constant stream of Megan's life being celebrated and my life being overlooked. And one day, I just muted it and felt the absence of its weight like taking off a backpack I'd worn so long I'd forgotten it was there. I didn't leave it. Leaving would have been a statement, a thing they could point to and call dramatic. I just muted it and checked it once a week, and felt, each time, a little more distant from the gravitational center I'd spent my whole life orbiting. My mother tried, for a while, the things that had always worked. She tried guilt. "I don't know what we did to deserve this coldness from you." She tried minimizing. "I really think you're making a much bigger deal of this than it needs to be." She tried the sweet voice, deployed not before an ask now but as its own kind of lure, trying to draw me back into the warm version of her that appeared right before she needed something. She tried once, getting Megan to call me, and Megan called and said, "Mom says you're upset about some old emails? That's like ancient history, Claire. Why are you keeping score about stuff from when we were kids?" And I realized, talking to my sister, that she genuinely did not understand, that she had grown up so thoroughly inside the warmth of being chosen that she could not even conceive of what it had been like on the outside of it, and that she was not a villain. She was just a person who had never once had to imagine my experience, because the family had been organized, so she'd never need to. I didn't try to make Megan understand. That was another thing I had to learn, that I was not obligated to win, that I did not need anyone to agree that I'd been wronged in order for it to be true. Patricia helped me with that. "You keep wanting them to validate your reality," she said, "but validation from the people who built the distortion is the one thing you're least likely to get. The freedom isn't in them admitting it. The freedom is in you no longer needing them to." So I told Megan, gently, "I'm not keeping score, Megan. I'm just done keeping the books." And she didn't understand that either. But it was true. And it was enough that I understood it. My father called me eventually. This surprised me, because my father did not call. My father squeezed shoulders on his way out of rooms. He did not pick up the phone to have a difficult conversation. But he called, and his voice was rough, and he said, "Your mother's pretty upset." And I said, "I know, Dad. I'm sorry she's upset, but I'm not going to pretend I didn't read what I read." And there was a long pause, and then my father said something that I think was the closest thing to an apology I will ever get from him. He said, "We did the best we could with what we knew." And I sat with that, and I decided not to argue with it, because in a way it was true. They probably did believe they were being practical, being realistic, being good parents who made hard choices. But I also said, because I'd finally learned how to say true things out loud, maybe. But it cost me a lot, Dad. And I'd have liked it if even one of you had ever just said you were sorry it cost me anything. And my father was quiet, and then he said, "I'm sorry, Claire." And I think he meant it. I think it was 34 years too late, and I think he only said it because the alternative was losing me entirely. But I think he meant it. And I decided that I could hold both of those things at once, that it was real, and that it was late, and that it didn't fix anything, but that I was glad to have it anyway. I'd love to tell you that the apology healed everything, that we all had a tearful reconciliation and the family transformed. It didn't. Real families don't transform from one phone call. What changed was smaller and more durable than that. What changed was me. I see my family now, but differently. I go to some holidays and skip others. I show up as a guest, not as the staff. When I'm there, I don't manage anything, I don't fix anything, I don't volunteer to handle the thing nobody else wants to handle. I sit at the table and I eat, and I make conversation, and if the work of the day needs doing, someone else does it or it doesn't get done. And I have learned to be okay with both. My mother has had to adjust to a daughter who is no longer infinitely available, and I think she finds me cold now, and I've made my peace with being called cold by a woman who once filed my future under "she'll be fine." Sometimes warmth, when it's only ever been the warmth that comes right before an ask, isn't a thing worth keeping. Sometimes the coldness they accuse you of is just you, finally, declining to be on fire for their benefit. The money I gave them over the years, the $12,000 for the house, the various tough spot rescues, I never got it back. And I decided not to chase it. Not because I forgave the debt out of love, but because chasing it would have meant staying in the transaction, and the whole point was to leave the transaction. I wrote it off, the way an accountant writes off a bad investment, with a clear eye and no illusions, and I let it go. The freedom was worth more than the money. The freedom was worth more than almost anything. David and I, after a long time and a lot of healing, decided to try one more time to have a child, and we have a daughter now. She's 2. Her name is June. And I look at her sometimes and I feel a fierce, almost frightening clarity about the kind of mother I'm going to be. She is not going to be the easy one or the hard one. She is not going to be an investment or a foregone conclusion. She is not going to learn that love is something you earn by needing nothing. If she ever has a sibling, that child will not be ranked against her, and neither of them will ever find an email someday that reduces their childhood to a budget decision. I am going to do for her the one thing my parents never managed to do for me, which is to make her certain, bone deep, unshakably certain that her place in my heart was never contingent on her being useful or impressive or low maintenance. That she gets to need things. That needing things is not a flaw to be managed, but a part of being a person who is loved. I think about those emails less now. For a while they lived in me like a wound I kept reopening, reading them over and over, looking for some hidden tenderness I might have missed. Some line where my mother said, "But we love Claire so much," that I'd somehow overlooked. There is no such line. I've accepted that. The emails are just what they are. Two reasonable people doing reasonable math, deciding that one of their children would be fine, and being right about it in the cruelest possible way, because I was fine. I am fine. I built a whole self out of being fine. The tragedy was never that I failed to be fine. The tragedy was that being fine was the only thing they ever asked of me, and I gave it to them perfectly. For free, for 34 years, and called it love because I didn't know there was anything else to call it. I know better now. I know what love is supposed to feel like, because David showed me. And because June shows me every single day with her sticky hands and her unreasonable demands and her absolute certainty that she deserves to be the center of someone's world. She does deserve it. So did I. So did the 17-year-old girl who put the green sweater back on the rack and felt proud of herself for being sensible. I think about her sometimes, that girl, and I wish I could reach back through all these years and tell her the thing it took me 3 decades and a folder of old emails to learn. I'd tell her that she wasn't fine because she didn't need anything. She was fine because she was strong enough to survive needing things and never being given them. And those are not the same. They were never the same. I don't hate my family. I want to end on that, because I think it's the truest and most surprising thing. I thought when I found the emails that the end of this road would be hatred or estrangement, or some cold final door slammed shut forever. But that's not where I landed. I landed somewhere quieter. I landed in a place where I can love my parents for who they actually are, instead of who I needed them to be, which means loving them at a distance, with my eyes open, without handing them my whole self to manage. I landed in a place where Megan is my sister, and I can be glad for her good life without it costing me mine. I landed in a place where the books are closed, and the scorekeeping is done, and there's nothing left to settle, because I stopped agreeing to be the one who pays. The last time I was at my parents' house, I noticed the family photo wall in the hallway, the one I'd walked past 1,000 times. It's mostly Megan. Megan's dance recitals, Megan's wedding, Megan's kids. There are a few of me scattered in. The obligatory ones. Graduation. That kind of thing. And I stood there, and I looked at that wall, and for the first time in my life it didn't hurt. Because I finally understood that the wall was never a record of how much I was loved. It was just a record of where the attention went. And I don't live on that wall anymore. I live in a small house 2 hours away, with a man who sees me and a daughter who needs me, and a life I built with my own 2 hands out of loans and long hours, and the stubborn, unkillable belief that I was worth investing in, even when the people who were supposed to invest in me decided I'd be fine without it. They were right. I'm fine. I'm just fine on my own terms now, and that has made all the difference.